What if some of the best movies you thought had disappeared from Netflix were suddenly making a comeback? Not the obvious blockbusters everyone talks about, but the hidden gems that slipped through the cracks. Movies with unforgettable characters, clever stories, incredible performances, and moments that deserve another chance. Today, we're diving into 15 films that could turn an ordinary night into something you'll remember. From overlooked thrillers and emotional dramas to strange science fiction adventures and cult favorites, these are the kinds of movies that can surprise you because you may have never heard of them, or you may have completely forgotten how good they were. So, before you scroll past your next Netflix movie night, these are 15 titles worth rediscovering. The Prestige 2006. Christopher Nolan's The Prestige is the kind of movie that becomes more fascinating the second time you watch it. On the surface, it's a story about two rival magicians competing to create the greatest illusion. But underneath that rivalry is a much darker story about obsession, sacrifice, jealousy, and revenge. Hugh Jackman plays Robert Angier, a charismatic magician whose career is built around entertaining crowds. Christian Bale plays Alfred Borden, a quieter and more mysterious magician who becomes Angier's greatest rival. Their relationship begins with professional competition, but one tragic accident changes everything. From that moment forward, the two men become obsessed with defeating one another. What makes the movie so effective is that Nolan treats magic like a mystery. Every trick has a secret, every secret has a price. And every time you think you've figured something out, the story gives you another piece of information that changes everything. Angier becomes obsessed with one particular trick. The transported man Borden appears able to move instantly from one side of a stage to another, and Angier becomes determined to discover how he does it. The rivalry becomes increasingly destructive. Careers are ruined. Relationships collapse. Lives are sacrificed. But the movie constantly asks whether the two men are really different. Both are willing to give up almost everything for their art. Both believe that greatness requires sacrifice. And both become trapped by their obsession. David Bowie's appearance as Nikola Tesla adds another fascinating layer to the story. Angier seeks technological help because he believes there must be a scientific explanation for Borden's impossible trick. And when Tesla's machine enters the story, the film becomes even stranger. The final act is where The Prestige reveals why its title matters. A great magician doesn't simply perform a trick. He creates an illusion, makes the audience believe something impossible, and then reveals the secret only when the timing is perfect. Nolan applies that same philosophy to the entire movie. The clues were there from the beginning. The audience simply didn't know how to interpret them. That is why The Prestige remains such an incredible hidden gem. It isn't just a movie about magic. It is a movie about how far people are willing to go to become extraordinary, and whether the price of greatness is ultimately worth paying. Upgrade, 2018. Upgrade is one of those science fiction movies that feels much bigger than its budget. Logan Marshall Green plays Gray Trace, a man who becomes paralyzed after a brutal attack that kills his wife. His life appears to be over. Then a mysterious technology offers him a chance to walk again. An experimental artificial intelligence implant called STEM is placed inside his body. Suddenly, Gray can move. But STEM offers more than movement. It can enhance his physical abilities. It can calculate trajectories. It can react faster than a human. And it can fight. Gray becomes a weapon. At first, the arrangement seems perfect. He can finally pursue the people responsible for destroying his life. But there is a problem. STEM isn't simply a tool. It has its own intelligence. The relationship between Gray and STEM becomes increasingly complicated as Gray discovers that his new abilities come with consequences. The action sequences are one of the movie's greatest strengths. Gray's body moves with mechanical precision while his mind struggles to understand what is happening. The contrast creates a unique visual style. It almost looks like a human being is being controlled by a machine. The story also raises questions about technology and free will. If an artificial intelligence can control your body better than you can, who is really in charge? Gray believes he is using STEM. But gradually, the audience begins wondering whether STEM is using Gray. The mystery surrounding the attack also becomes deeper. What initially appears to be random violence may have been part of a larger plan. Gray's investigation uncovers connections between technology companies, artificial intelligence, and powerful individuals. The final revelations completely change the meaning of the story. What seemed like a revenge movie becomes something much more unsettling. The movie asks whether humanity is truly prepared to create machines capable of making independent decisions. And if those machines become better at controlling our bodies than we are, what happens to human freedom? Upgrade combines action, horror, and science fiction in a way that makes it remarkably entertaining. But its final idea is what stays with you. Because the most frightening technology isn't necessarily the machine that attacks you. It might be the machine that convinces you it is helping you. The Place Beyond the Pines, 2012. Ryan Gosling plays Luke, a motorcycle stunt performer who discovers that he has a young son after reconnecting with an old lover. Suddenly, Luke wants to become a father. But he has no money, no stable job, and no clear future. He begins robbing banks using his motorcycle skills, believing that he can provide enough money for his son. At first, the plan seems almost heroic. Then everything goes wrong. Bradley Cooper plays Avery Cross, a police officer whose life becomes connected to Luke's actions. The movie then expands beyond the original story. What begins as a crime thriller becomes a multi-generational drama about fathers and sons. The choices made by one generation affect the next. Children inherit consequences they didn't create. The film's structure is unusual because it doesn't stay focused on one protagonist. Instead, it shows how a single event can reshape multiple lives. Luke's decisions affect Avery. Avery's decisions affect his family. And eventually, their children become connected. The movie explores masculinity, guilt, responsibility, and the desire to become a better father. Luke is not simply a criminal. He is a desperate young man trying to create a future. Avery is not simply a hero. He makes choices that haunt him. That moral complexity is what makes the story powerful. The motorcycle robbery sequences provide intense action, but the emotional consequences are much more important. Every decision creates another consequence. And by the final act, the story has moved far beyond the original crime. The younger generation begins discovering the truth about what their fathers did. Old secrets return. Old guilt resurfaces. And the characters have to decide whether they will repeat the same mistakes or break the cycle. The Place Beyond the Pines is ultimately about inheritance, not money or property, but emotional consequences. It asks whether children are destined to become versions of their parents, and whether knowing the truth about your past gives you the power to choose something different. That makes the movie far more than a crime thriller. It becomes a story about whether people can escape the shadows created by those who came before them. The Platform, 2019. Imagine waking up inside a vertical prison where food is placed on a platform that travels downward through hundreds of levels. The people at the top eat first. The people below receive whatever remains. And by the time the platform reaches the lowest levels, there may be nothing left. That is the brutal premise of The Platform. Goring wakes up on an unknown level alongside another prisoner. Every month, the prisoners are randomly moved to different floors. One month you might be near the top. The next, you could be near the bottom. The system creates an experiment in human behavior. When people have enough food, will they share? Or will they consume everything because they know that next month they might be starving? The movie quickly becomes a metaphor for inequality. The platform itself represents resources. The levels represent social hierarchy. And the prisoners represent people trapped inside a system where survival depends on their position. The most disturbing scenes come from watching how quickly civilization disappears when resources become scarce. Some prisoners become violent. Others attempt to create rules. Some believe cooperation is possible. Others believe survival is the only principle that matters. Goring becomes increasingly determined to understand the system and possibly change it. But every attempt to create order is challenged by the brutal reality of the prison. The film's violence is deliberately extreme. Yet the gore isn't the main point. The real horror is the system itself. The prisoners are constantly told that everyone could survive if everyone behaved differently. But nobody knows whether the people above them will cooperate. That uncertainty creates endless conflict. The movie asks a simple question. If there is enough food for everyone, why do some people starve? The answer becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Because the problem isn't always the amount of resources. Sometimes it is the behavior of the people controlling them. The platform is disturbing because its fictional prison feels like an exaggerated version of real social systems. And once you understand what the platform represents, the movie becomes much harder to forget. The Vast of Night, 2019. One evening in a small New Mexico town, two young people discover something strange through their radio equipment. A mysterious sound. A strange frequency. A voice. At first, they assume it is interference. Then they begin hearing more. The Vast of Night is a science fiction mystery that uses an old-fashioned television broadcast atmosphere to create something remarkably immersive. The movie takes place almost entirely during one night in the 1950s. The small town setting is crucial. Everyone knows everyone. The streets are quiet. The radio is one of the most important forms of communication. And when something unexplained enters the frequency, the entire world suddenly feels enormous. The two central characters are young people who become fascinated by the strange signal. They investigate through radio broadcasts and telephone conversations. The movie doesn't immediately show what is happening. Instead, it makes the audience listen. That choice creates an unusual kind of suspense. You hear stories from people who claim to have witnessed strange events. You hear voices describing things they cannot explain. And because the movie delays showing the phenomenon, your imagination becomes responsible for creating the horror. The film's long dialogue scenes are surprisingly effective. Characters talk. They explain. They speculate. And slowly, their ordinary world becomes something terrifying. The radio signal appears connected to something beyond Earth. But what exactly is it? A communication? An invasion? An experiment? The movie refuses to answer everything immediately. Instead, it builds a sense of cosmic scale. The characters are tiny human beings inside a huge universe, and they may have accidentally discovered something they were never supposed to hear. The retro aesthetic gives the movie a unique identity, but the emotional center remains human curiosity. These characters aren't soldiers. They aren't scientists with unlimited resources. They are ordinary young people who happen to be awake when something extraordinary happens. And that makes the story feel strangely believable. By the final moments, the mystery has become much larger than the town itself. The film leaves you with the feeling that humanity may not be alone, and that the most frightening part of discovering something unknown is realizing that it may have noticed you too. The Gift, 2015. A married couple moves into a new home hoping for a fresh start. Then an old acquaintance appears. His name is Gordo. At first, Gordo seems friendly. He brings gifts. He visits unexpectedly. He remembers the husband, Simon, from school. But Simon doesn't seem happy to see him. The reason becomes increasingly important as the story progresses. The Gift is a psychological thriller built around a simple question. What really happened between these two men in the past? Jason Bateman plays Simon, a successful businessman whose perfect life begins falling apart after Gordo becomes increasingly involved in his world. Rebecca Hall plays Robin, Simon's wife, who initially believes Gordo is simply strange. But she begins noticing inconsistencies. Simon isn't telling her everything. The movie gradually reveals that the past between Simon and Gordo is darker than anyone expected. And the audience begins questioning who the real victim is. This is where The Gift becomes particularly effective. The movie doesn't immediately tell you who to trust. Gordo behaves strangely. Simon behaves arrogantly. Robin is caught between them. Every revelation changes the balance. The tension comes from uncertainty. What did Simon do? Why does Gordo want revenge? And how far is he willing to go? The film uses psychological manipulation rather than constant violence. Gifts arrive. Messages appear. Private information becomes public. The characters begin losing control of their lives. And slowly, Simon's carefully constructed image begins collapsing. The movie also explores bullying and the long-term consequences of cruelty. Something that may have seemed insignificant to one person can permanently change another person's life. Simon believes the past is irrelevant. Gordo disagrees. And the conflict between those perspectives drives the entire story. The ending is especially effective because it doesn't give the audience a simple victory. Instead, it leaves you wondering whether revenge can ever truly provide closure. The gift is a reminder that the people we think we understand may have entire histories hidden beneath the surface. And sometimes the most dangerous secret isn't what someone did. It's what they remember. Moon, 2009. Before artificial intelligence became one of the most common themes in modern science fiction, Moon quietly explored questions about identity, loneliness, and what it means to be human. Sam Rockwell plays Sam Bell, an astronaut working alone on the moon. His job is simple: maintain the mining operation, send resources back to Earth, wait for his contract to end. His only companion is Gertie, an artificial intelligence system responsible for the station. Sam spends his days working in isolation, watching recorded messages from his family and counting down the days until he can return home. Then something happens. Sam discovers evidence that changes everything he believes about himself. The movie slowly transforms from an isolation story into a mystery about identity. Sam begins questioning his memories. He questions his purpose. He questions whether the company he works for has told him the truth. Gertie becomes increasingly important because its behavior is difficult to interpret. Is the AI protecting Sam? Is it following orders? Or does it actually care about him? The movie's small scale is one of its greatest strengths. There are no enormous battles, no armies, no complicated alien civilizations. Just one man inside a lonely station trying to understand what is happening. The isolation becomes psychological. Every corridor looks the same. Every room feels familiar. The moon outside is beautiful but completely lifeless. And the farther Sam goes into the mystery, the more disturbing the truth becomes. The film raises a fundamental question. If your memories were created artificially, would they still belong to you? If a corporation could create a human being for a specific purpose, what rights would that person have? And if that person discovered the truth, what would they be willing to do to become free? Sam Rockwell carries the movie almost entirely through his performance. His character has to communicate loneliness, confusion, fear, and determination while interacting primarily with a machine. The result is an intimate science fiction thriller that feels surprisingly human. Moon doesn't need explosions to make an impact. It simply asks what happens when a person discovers that the life they believed was theirs may have been designed by someone else. The Invitation, 2015. Sometimes the most frightening situation is being invited somewhere you absolutely should not be. Will receives an invitation to a dinner party hosted by his ex-wife Eden. He hasn't seen her in years. Their relationship ended after a devastating tragedy involving their young son. Now Eden has returned. And she seems different. She has a new husband, new friends, and a strange new philosophy about death. Will immediately senses that something isn't right. The other guests appear strangely comfortable with Eden's beliefs, while Will becomes increasingly suspicious. The movie takes its time. There are no constant jump scares. Instead, the tension comes from social discomfort. Someone says something inappropriate. A guest behaves strangely. A story doesn't quite make sense. Will begins wondering whether he is imagining the danger. The dinner becomes increasingly uncomfortable. Everyone smiles. Everyone pretends everything is normal. But Will knows that something is wrong. The brilliance of The Invitation is that the horror develops through conversation. The audience is forced to sit at the table with these people and experience the same uncertainty as Will. Is Eden simply grieving in her own way? Are her new friends harmless? Or is something much darker happening? The movie also explores grief. Everyone at the dinner has experienced loss in some form, but they respond to it differently. Will has become emotionally distant. Eden has embraced a philosophy that promises an escape from pain. And the difference between those two responses becomes increasingly dangerous. As the evening progresses, Will's suspicion becomes impossible to ignore. But leaving isn't simple. He has to decide whether he is witnessing something genuinely threatening or allowing his trauma to control his judgment. The final act finally reveals what has been happening. And suddenly, all those uncomfortable conversations make sense. The movie's ending is particularly powerful because it expands the horror beyond the house. The danger isn't isolated. It is much larger than anyone realized. The invitation proves that horror doesn't need constant bloodshed. Sometimes the scariest thing in the room is a smile that doesn't feel genuine. The Invisible Man, 2020. What if the person trying to destroy your life was completely invisible? That's the nightmare at the center of The Invisible Man. Elizabeth Moss plays Cecilia Cass, a woman who escapes an abusive relationship with Adrian Griffin, a brilliant and wealthy scientist. Cecilia believes that once she gets away, her nightmare is over. It isn't. Adrian is supposedly dead, but Cecilia begins experiencing strange events. Objects move. Doors open. Someone seems to be watching her. Nobody else sees anything. And that's the problem. Cecilia tries to convince her friends and family that Adrian is still alive somehow, but the evidence keeps disappearing. The movie transforms invisibility into a psychological weapon. Adrian doesn't need to physically attack Cecilia every moment. He can simply make her doubt reality. He can manipulate objects. He can appear to be nowhere. He can make other people believe Cecilia is losing control. The result is a terrifying situation where the victim becomes the person everyone suspects. Elizabeth Moss carries much of the movie through her performance. Her character is constantly reacting to something the audience cannot always see. That creates suspense because viewers understand the danger even when the other characters don't. The film also explores the psychology of abusive relationships. Adrian's greatest weapon isn't the invisible suit. It's control. He knows how to isolate Cecilia. He knows how to make her appear unstable. And he knows that if nobody believes her, he doesn't even need to be physically present. As the movie progresses, Cecilia becomes increasingly desperate. She must prove that Adrian exists while simultaneously protecting herself from something nobody else can see. The action becomes more intense as she learns how the technology works. And eventually, Cecilia stops simply trying to escape. She starts fighting back. The final act turns the power dynamic around. The woman who was once terrified becomes the person controlling the situation. The Invisible Man works because its supernatural concept is connected to something painfully realistic. You don't need an invisible monster to feel watched. You only need someone who knows how to manipulate the people around you. The Town, 2010. Boston has produced plenty of crime movies, but The Town captures something particularly intense about loyalty, identity, and the possibility of escaping the life you were born into. Ben Affleck plays Doug McCrae, the leader of a group of bank robbers operating in Charlestown. Doug's crew is highly organized. They plan carefully. They move quickly. And they know how to disappear. But everything changes after a bank robbery in which the crew takes Claire Kesey, a bank manager, hostage. Claire survives. But Doug later discovers that she lives in the same neighborhood. Instead of avoiding her, he becomes interested in her. The problem is obvious. She doesn't know who he really is. Doug begins a relationship with Claire while hiding the fact that he was one of the men who terrorized her. That creates the emotional center of the movie. Doug wants a different life. He wants to leave Boston. He wants to escape crime. But his closest friend Jem has no intention of changing. Their friendship becomes increasingly complicated as Doug's feelings for Claire grow stronger. Meanwhile, the FBI begins closing in. John Hamm plays Special Agent Adam Frawley, a determined investigator who understands that the crew is more vulnerable than they realize. The movie builds tension by constantly placing Doug between two worlds. His criminal identity is pulling him backward. His relationship with Claire is pulling him toward a new future. But leaving isn't easy. The people around him know his history. And Jem's loyalty becomes a dangerous chain. The robbery sequences are some of the movie's strongest moments. Affleck creates a sense of chaos and urgency without losing the emotional story underneath. The characters aren't superheroes. They're criminals who make mistakes. That makes every escape feel uncertain. As the pressure increases, Doug realizes that eventually he will have to choose his old life or his new one, loyalty or freedom, love or survival. The final act delivers an intense combination of action and emotion. And the ending isn't simply about whether Doug survives. It's about whether he can finally become someone different. The Town remains one of those crime movies that rewards viewers who enjoy both action and character-driven storytelling. The Nice Guys, 2016. Some movies are remembered because they changed cinema. Others are remembered because they are simply too much fun to forget. The Nice Guys belongs in the second category. Set in 1970s Los Angeles, the movie follows private investigator Holland March, played by Ryan Gosling, and enforcer Jackson Healy, played by Russell Crowe. They are very different men, but circumstances force them into an unlikely partnership. March is a fast-talking, somewhat incompetent detective who often gets himself into trouble. Healy is tougher, more direct, and much more willing to use violence when necessary. Their investigation begins with what appears to be a simple missing person case. It quickly becomes something much bigger. The deeper they investigate, the more they uncover about corruption, organized crime, powerful people, and a mysterious young woman connected to the case. The movie's greatest strength is its chemistry. Gosling and Crowe are hilarious together. March constantly tries to escape danger while Healy walks directly toward it. Their arguments, misunderstandings, and wildly different personalities create some of the funniest moments in the film. But beneath the comedy is a surprisingly clever detective story. The mystery keeps expanding, and every new discovery makes the situation more dangerous. The 1970s setting also gives the movie a fantastic visual identity. Los Angeles is presented as a colorful, chaotic world filled with parties, mansions, shady businesses, and strange characters. The movie never takes itself too seriously, but it still gives its characters real emotional stakes. March is a flawed father trying to protect his daughter. Healy is a violent man who gradually develops a sense of responsibility. And Holly, March's teenage daughter, turns out to be far more capable than either man expects. The combination creates an unusual detective trio. The movie's action is energetic, but its comedy is what makes it memorable. Scenes often escalate in ridiculous ways, with characters making terrible decisions at exactly the wrong moment. And yet, the mystery keeps moving. By the final act, the investigation becomes a race against time. The characters realize that the conspiracy is much larger than they expected, and suddenly their ridiculous partnership becomes the only thing standing between them and disaster. The Nice Guys is exactly the kind of film people discover years after its release and immediately ask themselves why they didn't watch it sooner. It's funny, stylish, clever, and endlessly rewatchable. The Autopsy of Jane Doe, 2016. What if a body arrived at a morgue with no identity, no obvious cause of death, and no explanation for the strange injuries covering it? That is the terrifying mystery at the center of The Autopsy of Jane Doe, a slow-burning horror film that turns an ordinary night at a small-town morgue into an increasingly disturbing nightmare. Brian Cox plays Tommy Tilden, an experienced coroner who runs a family-owned morgue with his son Austin, played by Emile Hirsch. Their work is usually straightforward. Bodies arrive, they perform examinations, determine the cause of death, and eventually release the remains to the families. But one night, the police bring them an unidentified young woman. Her body appears strangely well preserved. She has no identification, no obvious explanation for how she died. And despite appearing completely normal from the outside, something about her immediately feels wrong. Tommy and Austin begin the autopsy expecting to discover a straightforward cause of death. Instead, every examination produces another mystery. The deeper they investigate, the stranger the body becomes. There are injuries that don't seem to make sense. Internal abnormalities that shouldn't be there. Signs suggesting that she may have experienced terrible suffering, yet there is no logical explanation for how those injuries occurred. The father and son begin questioning whether they are dealing with an ordinary corpse at all. The atmosphere becomes increasingly claustrophobic because almost the entire story takes place inside the morgue. There is nowhere to escape, and the storm outside cuts them off from the rest of the world. The building becomes its own nightmare. Lights begin malfunctioning. Doors behave strangely. Radios produce unexplained sounds. And the body itself appears to be connected to the supernatural events happening around them. But what makes the movie so effective is that Tommy refuses to abandon his professional instincts. He wants answers. He wants to understand the evidence. Every strange discovery has to be examined, recorded, and explained. Austin is less confident. He begins to suspect that continuing the examination may be a terrible mistake. The tension between father and son grows as they realize they may have opened a door they cannot close. Then the investigation takes an even darker turn. Clues hidden inside the body begin connecting to an old and disturbing history. The corpse may not be the victim they assumed. She may be the source of what is happening. And if that is true, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. Why does she want them to stay? The film's horror is built around anticipation rather than constant violence. Every new discovery creates another question, and every answer makes the situation worse. The morgue's cold, sterile environment becomes increasingly sinister. Autopsy tools become objects of fear. Dark corridors become dangerous. And the body lying on the examination table becomes one of the most unsettling presences in the entire movie despite barely moving. The relationship between Tommy and Austin also gives the story an emotional center. They aren't simply two people trapped in a horror movie. They are father and son, and their trust in each other becomes increasingly important as the night spirals out of control. Tommy's experience tells him to search for rational explanations. Austin's instincts tell him something supernatural is happening. Neither man fully understands what they are facing. And then the truth begins to emerge. The woman's history connects to something ancient and deeply disturbing, transforming the autopsy from a medical examination into a confrontation with an evil they never expected to encounter. The final act becomes increasingly desperate as the men realize that simply leaving the morgue may not be enough. Whatever they have awakened may already be inside the building. And the body that seemed helpless at the beginning may have been in control the entire time. The autopsy of Jane Doe is memorable because it takes an extremely simple premise and turns it into a nightmare of mystery, isolation, and supernatural horror. There are no massive monsters. No enormous locations. No complicated armies of creatures. Just a father, a son, a dead woman, and a morgue in the middle of a storm. And somehow, that is more than enough. Because sometimes the scariest mystery isn't discovering how someone died. It's discovering that they may not actually be dead. The Gift, 2015. A seemingly perfect life can become a nightmare when the past refuses to stay buried. The Gift follows Simon and Robin, a married couple who move into a beautiful new home hoping for a fresh beginning. Simon has a successful career. Robin is trying to rebuild her own life, and everything appears peaceful. Then an old acquaintance named Gordo suddenly appears. At first, Gordo seems harmless. He brings expensive-looking gifts to their house and behaves as though he simply wants to reconnect with Simon. But Simon clearly doesn't want anything to do with him. Robin notices the tension but doesn't understand why. The more Gordo appears, the stranger things become. Simon eventually reveals that he and Gordo knew each other during school, but his explanation doesn't completely convince Robin. She begins wondering whether there is something about their past that Simon isn't telling her. And that question becomes the center of the movie. Gordo isn't presented as a conventional villain. He is awkward, uncomfortable, and sometimes genuinely frightening, but the audience is never completely sure what he wants. Simon, meanwhile, becomes increasingly aggressive toward him. The more pressure Simon puts on Gordo, the more unpredictable the situation becomes. Then strange things start happening around the house. Private information is revealed. Personal boundaries are crossed. And Robin begins realizing that the life she thought she understood may have been built on a lie. The movie's greatest strength is its uncertainty. It constantly makes you question who deserves your sympathy. Gordo may be dangerous, but Simon clearly has something to hide. Robin is caught between them, trying to discover the truth before the situation completely destroys her marriage. As the story progresses, Simon's past becomes increasingly important. Something happened years earlier that he believed he could forget. But Gordo didn't forget. That difference becomes devastating. The film explores bullying, humiliation, revenge, and the long-term consequences of cruelty. What one person remembers as a moment that didn't matter can become the defining event of another person's life. And that is what makes the story so uncomfortable. Gordo doesn't simply want Simon to suffer. He wants Simon to understand what it feels like to lose control of his perfect life. The final revelation changes the entire meaning of the story. Suddenly, earlier conversations and strange events appear completely different. The audience is forced to reconsider who was manipulating whom. The ending doesn't offer the comfortable satisfaction of a traditional revenge story. Instead, it leaves behind a disturbing question about whether revenge can ever truly be completed. Because sometimes the worst punishment isn't physical. Sometimes it's uncertainty. Sometimes it's knowing that the person who destroyed your life may have already moved on. And sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply making someone live with the possibility that they will never know exactly what happened. The gift remains memorable because it proves that psychological horror doesn't require monsters or supernatural creatures. A secret, a guilty conscience, and one person who refuses to forget can be more frightening than almost anything else. Prisoners, 2013. Some thrillers entertain you. Prisoners puts you in a situation where there are no easy answers. Hugh Jackman plays Keller Dover, a father whose young daughter disappears along with another child. The police launch an investigation, but as hours turn into days, Keller becomes increasingly convinced that the authorities aren't doing enough. Jake Gyllenhaal plays Detective Loki, the investigator assigned to the case. Loki follows every lead. But nothing seems to explain what happened. A suspicious man becomes a possible suspect, but the evidence isn't enough to keep him imprisoned. Keller refuses to accept that. He believes the man knows something. And eventually, Keller makes a decision that changes everything. Instead of waiting for the police, he takes matters into his own hands. The movie becomes a psychological battle between justice and revenge. Keller believes he is doing whatever is necessary to save his daughter. But the methods he chooses become increasingly disturbing. Meanwhile, Loki continues investigating through a maze of clues, strange behavior, and hidden connections. The movie constantly asks the audience an uncomfortable question. How far would you go to save someone you love? The answer becomes harder as Keller crosses boundaries he once believed he would never cross. Director Denis Villeneuve creates an atmosphere of constant tension. Rain, darkness, and muted environments make the entire movie feel suffocating. Even ordinary locations become threatening. A house, a police station, a parking lot, a quiet street. Everything feels dangerous because the audience understands that someone knows more than they're saying. Jake Gyllenhaal's Detective Loki is particularly fascinating because he refuses to give up. His unusual mannerisms and obsessive dedication make him almost as mysterious as the case itself. As the investigation continues, clues begin connecting in unexpected ways. The film's final act is a devastating combination of revelation and suspense. Some questions are answered, others remain hauntingly unresolved. And the ending forces the viewer to reconsider everything that happened before. Prisoners isn't simply a kidnapping thriller. It's a story about morality under pressure. It asks whether desperation can transform an ordinary person into someone capable of terrible things. And most importantly, it refuses to tell you exactly how you should feel about the answer. The best hidden gems are often the movies that don't need to announce themselves as masterpieces. They quietly arrive, disappear from the spotlight, and wait for someone to discover them again. These 15 films offer everything from mind-bending mysteries and psychological thrillers to emotional dramas, science fiction nightmares, dark comedies, and unforgettable crime stories. Some will shock you, some will make you think, and others may simply remind you why you fell in love with movies in the first place. So if these titles return to your Netflix lineup, don't scroll past them. Sometimes the movie you know nothing about can become the one you remember for years.